His latest rant included a line about the, quote, happy grandfather bungling Russia's campaign in Ukraine. It was posted May 9th, just as Vladimir Putin was presiding over the Victory Day parade on Red Square. Who is Yevgeny Prigozhin referring to? And why has he so spectacularly stepped out of the shadows of running a troll farm and a mercenary group to grabbing the spotlight? The former St. Petersburg hot dog salesman's become so high profile that he's now a magnet for Western sanctions. Never has the leader of the Wagner group directly criticized the big boss, so it's anyone's guess who he's referring to, if it's not just a bit of court intrigue and theatrics. Fact is, the Wagner group has raised its profile. It now has a long track record in Syria, Libya, and particularly these days in sub-Saharan Africa, where wherever there are diamonds and gold, white men speaking Russian seem to emerge. Guns for hire by the highest bidder, or paramilitaries who ultimately answer only to Putin. We'll try to follow the money and ask about the role of irregulars in times of war. With the noose of Western sanctions tightening, how crucial is the revenue stream provided by Wagner to Moscow? Where do all those recruits from places like Russian prisons go next? And what does it mean for erupting conflicts in places like Sudan, where there are gold mines? And guess what else? Well, Wagner mercenaries. Today in the France 24 debate, Putin's private army seeking the spotlight. With us, retired General Dominique Trinquant, former head of France's military mission to the United Nations. Welcome back. Welcome back as well to Thierry Vircoulon, associate researcher at the Africa Center of the French International Relations think tank, IFRI. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
And joining us from Brazzaville, Raphaël Parence, a Eurasia Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and co-author of a new report entitled The Wagner Group's Expanding Global Footprint. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Fools rush in where angels fear to tread. So let's first listen to that excerpt from this long Tuesday tirade by Yevgeny Prigozhin.
И вместо того, чтобы потратить снаряд, убить противника, сохранить жизнь нашего солдата, убивают наших солдат, а счастливый дедушка думает, что ему хорошо. И что делать дальше стране, если он окажется прав? Дай Бог всем здоровья. А вот что делать стране, что делать нашим детям, внукам, будущему России, и как выиграть войну, если вдруг случайно, я просто предполагаю, окажется, что этот дедушка законченный мудак?
What if the happy grandfather is an effing moron? There were a lot of explicatives, Thierry Vircoulon, in that a clip there. Who's he referring to?
Well, apparently he's referring to Vladimir Putin, but there's a lot of tensions in the...
Is he referring to Vladimir Putin?
Well, there's speculation.
It could also be referring to Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister.
Yeah, well, it's illustrating the tensions that are now very strong in the security apparatus in Moscow.
What makes you think it might be Putin?
Well, I mean, there's been actually quite a lot of speculation about the fact that the connection between Yevgeny Prigozhin and Putin is becoming more and more difficult, and that his profile is now too high for Putin. And so, despite the fact that all over those years he was supported by Putin, maybe now it's becoming a bit too embarrassing in a way.
When he wants to talk about Shoigu, he's quoting very clearly Shoigu. When he wants to speak about Putin, he never put the name in front of that. And the nickname "grandfather" in the bunker, was the nickname given to Putin during the COVID in Moscow. Everybody was speaking about the grandfather in the bunker. So I think he's clearly speaking of Putin without putting the name, because, as you said, it's just too dangerous, and that's why.
It's a pretty bold move. Would you call the grandfather an effing moron? If you're Yevgeny Prigozhin?
That's Prigozhin is using the word the Russians are using.
Is this how you hear it and see it, Raphael Parence?
Well, I think Prigozhin's trying to create this image of himself as a maverick who's sort of operating outside of the traditional, Kremlin sphere of party politics. But I think this really just plays him directly into that sphere. And at the same time, it allows him to be at arm's length from the Russian state, which is really where he and Wagner Group has to be, because the group is essentially outlawed under Russian law.
Outlawed under Russian law. From operating on Russian territory. We're joined by Nyagade Bakayoko. Paris Traffic could not keep away the chair of the African Security Sector Network Consultancy.
Good evening.
We won't move on without first getting you a chance to weigh in. The happy grandfather that Yevgeny Prigozhin referred to on Tuesday, is it the defense minister or is it the president himself of Russia?
It could be both, if I may say. I don't know. Anyway, what is very interesting is the kind of internal power struggle we are presently witnessing within the Russian decision-making circles.
Of course, there is this calculus, General Trinquant, that all this is a bit of theater orchestrated by the Kremlin because... Wagner, its role for what lies next on the battlefield in Ukraine will be limited, and it's time for it to move to other pastures.
Yeah, I think that Wagner was very important because of Prigozhin wanted to offer a victory to Russia in Bakhmut. He was not able to achieve this aim, and so that's why he's shouting as he's shouting against the Russian army who is not providing what he wants. The problem is that by this word, he shows that he's depending from the army. So he's in a very bad position, in fact, because he's depending on the army, but he's fighting the army, and he's not able to offer the victory. So I think that for the last month, because he has been fighting in Bakhmut for many months now, he has not achieved what he wanted to achieve. So he wants to jump in another position. When he said that he will leave Bakhmut, of course, he's not doing really that, but he's protecting his forces in order to have his forces prepared for something else. Everything is waiting for the Ukrainian offensive. So there will be something else. Bakhmut will no longer be a victory because Bakhmut has achieved nothing in several months for the Russian army.
And if Prigozhin decides to pull his Wagner mercenaries out of eastern Ukraine, others say, well, they're ready and happy to pick up the slack.
If the elder brother Prigozhin and Wagner fighters leave, the General Staff will lose an experienced combat unit, but the younger brother Kadyrov and the Akhmat unit will replace them in Bakhmut. If such a scenario is implemented, our fighters are ready to advance and take the city.
Thierry Vircoulon, at the outset of the war, it was said, the Chechens are coming. They're the ones who are going to make big headway. They haven't had as high a profile as the mercenaries of Wagner. Were you expecting that a year ago?
No, not really. Actually, I think it's a bit of a surprise. But I think Wagner is very different in a way. When you look at what it is, it's not only a military force or a paramilitary force. It's much more than that. It's a kind of a holding, basically, that provides not only military services, but also economic and political services. So it's much bigger than that issue of military power and projecting force on the battlefield. It's actually more subtle. The organization is actually more subtle than that. And what is the problem now with Prigozhin having such a high profile and being so vocal is that he cannot be anymore the tool of the secret diplomacy of the Kremlin. elsewhere in the world, because it's too visible, because he has now, he wanted, I think, to be the one who will have a victory in Bakhmut, and it didn't work that way.
It didn't work that way. I want to get back to how the role will evolve and is evolving in other places around the world. But first, General Trinquant, when you have an army that's waging a war, you have different units. Here in France, there's the Foreign Legion. But that answers directly to the chain of command in Paris through the regular channels of the military. You have paramilitary groups. You have mercenaries. When you think of a country like Russia, which had in the past the Cossacks, where does Wagner lie? Is it something that answers to who and how? What category do you put it in?
First, in France, you can't have mercenaries. And normally in Russia, you can't have mercenaries. That's the trick, in fact. The second point is that if you took the point on Chechen, very different. The Chechen is a foreign soldier under the command of Chechen who are put under command of the Russian army. So this can happen. If you take the example of France, you can have a Belgian unit, a British unit under command of the French unit, and they will fight together. Mercenaries is completely different. And the system which works between the army, and we see when Prigozhin is talking or shouting, the link between the army and the mercenaries is very different. The army is providing weapon system, but they are not under command of the Russian command. So they are doing what they want. They make the choice to attack in Bakhmut, but they need to have the support of the Russian army to fight. So this is the big difference. The Chechen will take a piece of land in the command of the Russian, under the command of the Russian. With the mercenaries, it's a bit different, with Wagner specifically.
All right, very, very different. And we were talking about at the outset, Yevgeny, about how Wagner, before there was all this plausible deniability of links with the Kremlin. Now the masks are off, and we're hearing from Yevgeny Prigozhin every day. We heard at the outset that clip about the happy grandfather. In fact, it's not the latest pronouncement. There's one more recent. It's not often these days that we report first on unanimous votes in France's parliament, which is also a pretty fractious place these days. But that's exactly what happened on Tuesday. Even a far right and a far left that was hitherto sympathetic at times to Moscow's arguments, approving as one a non-binding motion to urge the EU to put Wagner and its leader on their terror group list. Now, asked about France and its criticism of Wagner's role growing in the Central African Republic by a Russian journalist, Prigozhin reportedly saying, quote, "We can pull out rotten teeth from those bad mouths with pliers. We can pull out Macron's teeth and generally everyone's teeth who spill pathogenic filth about Wagner." It's just a bit of bluster, or how does Vladimir Putin react to that? How does Emmanuel Macron react to that?
No, what we can see is that Prigozhin is, to say the least, very provocative in the way he's qualifying his different partners. But what is very important in my view is, as was mentioned by Thierry Vircoulon, not to continue considering Wagner only under a military lens. It is much more than this, and I would say that, in fact, Wagner is much more efficient on other fields than on the military ground. We can see that almost everywhere Wagner is experiencing failure or not a lot of success, to say the least. But where he is particularly efficient and dangerous is on the informational field. There, and it is a very new way to fight, even if, of course, there is a reinvigoration of propaganda techniques used during the Cold War. But we can see that there are also new methods which are based not only on social network, as said very
we showed
often.
on a previous show that you were on. We showed those cartoons of
exactly
that went viral,
also
showing the French as
TV,
bloodthirsty
also
mercenaries.
on TV, also on the radio, also with civil society organizations, and this is very, very new. And this is one of the reasons why I think that this kind of law, trying to consider Wagner as a terrorist group, is completely counterproductive, because we are mixing very different kind of threats. Why there is today a need to think about new laws and regulations to address this kind of new actors, which is embodied by Wagner Group, in my view.
So doesn't really change much, or doesn't move the dial, says Yevgeny Prigozhin, to put Wagner on a terror list?
No, not much actually. It's more. It's a way actually to embarrass those who could be the partners of Wagner. When you include such an organization in such a list, actually, it's not that you want to really disrupt their operations because they're operating clandestinely, but it's because you want to create a kind of vacuum around them, or at least to send the message as those who will partner with that organizations will get in trouble.
And before Sudan descended into all-out warfare, 2022 was a bumper year for Africa's third largest gold producer. There was a record 18 tons extracted, much of it at the Hassai gold mine northeast of the capital, Khartoum, but across the country as well, with allegations of, and here you see the map with the different places where gold is mined in Sudan, alleged atrocities committed by armed Russians against panhandlers in the western Darfur region. And already at the time, there was this rivalry between the head of the military, General al-Burhan, and Hemeti, and Moscow may have played a role. Last year, the New York Times, citing U.S. and Western sources, reported that Wagner had obtained lucrative Sudanese mining concessions that produce a stream of gold, a potential boost to the Kremlin's $130 billion gold stash that American officials worry is being used to blunt the effect of economic sanctions over the Ukraine war and propping up the ruble. There is more. In February, as Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine, Hemeti, the head of those other paramilitaries, the Sudanese ones, traveled to Moscow to give his backing to Russian plans to set up a navy base on the Red Sea, a move Burhan refused to endorse. The Times reports that Hemeti came bearing gold bullion. Raphaël Parence, let me ask you, is Wagner's main mission, as you heard Yevgeny Prigozhin say a moment ago, to win the information war or to corner the gold market for Moscow?
I would actually say it's option 3. It's gaining Port Sudan as a key port on the Red Sea for the Russian state. While I think the economic benefits are useful for the Russian state, especially right now, in order to project power into the future, I think the Kremlin prefers that as the key here.
And so they've got a lot riding on the fighting that's going on right now.
Yes, they do, and I don't think that they've necessarily chosen a side, although they've given weapons to the RSF. I don't think that they've necessarily decided that that's the wagon that they're going to hitch it to. I think they will probably play both sides until a winner becomes fairly clear.
General Tankon?
Yes, just 2 points. The first thing you must keep in mind that mercenaries, the aim is to make business, is to make money. And either you make money with gold or using information, you push the competitor out from the market and you take the market. Will it be a political market also? Of course, it's interesting. Initially, Wagner was recruited.
Yeah, but is that gold to line the pockets of the leadership of Wagner or to send it back to Moscow?
Usually the business with Moscow is 25% for Putin. So Putin himself, I mean. So part of the money is going into Putin or to the government, and part of the business is going to Wagner. In Africa, Wagner is making money. In Ukraine, they are spending money. And that's why it's very difficult for Mr. Prigozhin to stay a long time like that, because he's spending a lot of money. He's paying a lot of soldiers who are killed, but some of them have been paid. In Central Africa, diamond. In Mali or in Sudan, gold. They are making money. And just a second point on the military point of view. Initially, Wagner was recruiting former special forces who wanted to make money and who were professional soldiers. And in small group, they were very efficient. But they lost these people, and now they are using people who are taking in jail or elsewhere who are not trained, and so they are very bad soldiers. That's why in Bakhmut they are not very good, in fact. They are using the Russian artillery, and the infantry is provided by people who are not really soldiers. They have lost this capacity in old special forces rented by Wagner.
And in that report you co-authored, Raphaël Parence, you express a special concern about that because some of those people sprung from jail could end up in Africa.
Yes, they certainly could, and it is really dependent on the war in Ukraine ending or winding down into a more low-intensity conflict than it is today. Should that occur, it's very likely that a lot of these people, whether they're prisoners or ex-military, current or former mercenaries, they will have a very clear and obvious market in Africa. And it's not necessarily just with Wagner Group. There are plenty of other mercenary and private military companies on the continent that are very involved and that would definitely be interested in their services.
Thierry Vircoulon?
Yeah, well, it's Wagner was born in Ukraine during the first conflict, so I think his end will be also in Ukraine, depending on how the conflict, in which direction the conflict goes there. But its expansion in Africa was a kind of, indeed, part of the secret diplomacy of the Kremlin, and also to get inside the massive gold smuggling system that is actually connecting Africa to Dubai, because most of that gold is going to Dubai. And when you analyze the network of Prigozhin's companies, you find also some imprints in Dubai. And I think, as you were asking about the issue about following the money, basically, and where the money goes, there are still some interesting investigation to do about where are those companies located, because in a report we published, we noticed that indeed Wagner Group has created several African subsidiaries in many countries, but they have also some other companies who are based in Dubai and elsewhere in the world. And so I think that network of companies will tell us where the money goes.
Where the money goes, and the United States, of course, and the Treasury Department keeping a keen eye on it. In February of this year, the Wall Street Journal reported that how U.S. intelligence warned Chad's strongman, Mahamat Déby, how Wagner is allegedly in cahoots with the rebels of the FACT, that's the Front pour l'Alternance et la Concorde au Tchad, a rebel group, the same one that killed Déby's own father. Nyagale Bakayoko, the Wagner mercenaries on the radar of the Americans and of the French.
Yes, of course. And not only on the radar of the French and the American, but of the Western world as a whole, because lots of European countries also are today justifying their will to stay committed on the African continent because of the rising presence of Russia and Wagner. There also has been a decision at the European Parliament regarding the terrorist status of Wagner. So yes, it is a major concern for all Western traditional partners of African country to to see such an importance of Wagner and Russia. But I think it's also very important to look at how Wagner is also pushing Russian influence on the African continent. Of course, they're trying to make profits, but not only. I think would be completely misleading if we would only consider Wagner as a profit private company with illegal methods. I think it's a bit too limitative.
Chad right now, a nation which is taking in refugees from Sudan by the tens of thousands. What stance is France taking? What stance is Chad taking vis-à-vis Russia and the Wagner Group?
Of course, France is trying to find after losing the first battle. Clearly, France has lost the first battle mainly in Mali, but also probably
its forces pulling out from Mali and Burkina Faso.
Because of that, and that's why I'm saying don't misunderstand what I'm saying. When I'm saying that they are making money and they put the people who were in place out, then they got freedom to do everything, politically, economically, and militarily. That's what they're doing. But of course, so France wants to fight that. And you're right, the Americans who are not very interested initially are now very interested in CAR, for example, in South Africa Republic. In Mali, it's more difficult, but in CAR, and supporting Chad because they don't want Chad to fail. So these are the two big issues. And the next step will be, of course, that CAR will push out Wagner, but CAR itself is not able to do that. So you've got to fight against Wagner in CAR, and that's what's happening. I mean, you had different attacks with drones against Wagner bases. You had attacks against the Wagner people. I received a message this morning about attacks. We don't know who is attacking, of course, as usual, but there are attacks. And I see that behind rebels, because these people are fighting Wagner, so they are opposing the president of CAR, because Wagner is protecting the president of CAR. And so this movement, will see how far it is going and how far the president of CAR will say, okay, I want to keep my power, and so probably Wagner is a problem for me. But this will take a long time, and certainly Wagner will not go out without being pushed out. I mean, they have got too many things in CAR currently. They've been for a long time in CAR, in fact.
In the Central African Republic, they've been there for a long time, and they've followed, of course, just like in Mali, a French pullout. Raphaël Parence, you agree with General Trinquant? It's going to be a long while before the Russians look for the exit in the Central African Republic.
Unfortunately, yes. I think unless there's a change in government that happens fairly soon, yes, I think they'll be there for a while. And even if, realistically, I think even if there is a change in government, they will probably maintain their presence at least around the main gold mine, because that is such an important part of their entire operation in Africa.
Yeah, the main gold mine there. Complaints about Wagner, well, they're sour grapes, insists Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, speaking last month at the United Nations.
Что касается Вагнера, это частная военная компания. Мы неоднократно.
In regards to the Wagner Group, this is a private military company. We have repeatedly touched upon this issue. A few years ago, our French colleagues and the head of diplomacy in the European Union, Josep Borrell, issued grievances towards our links to Mali and Central African Republic. They created some kind of a mini scandal about the fact that the government of Mali, under circumstances when the French began to withdraw their operations and began to close their military bases in northern Mali, where a major terrorism threat remained. In this situation, the government of Mali, in order not to be left without defenses, turned to the services of the private military company called Wagner.
и Центральноафриканская республика, и Мали, и Судан, ряд других стран, чьи правительства, чьи законные власти обращаются к такого рода услугам, имеют на это.
All right, first off, regarding that timeline, can you fact check that for us, Thierry Vircoulon? Is that how it happened in Mali?
No, not really. Actually, there are many evidence of the connection between the Wagner group and Moscow and the power in Russia. The first one, I just give you two. The first one is that every entry of Wagner into an African country has been preceded by a high-level meeting in Russia between the president or prime minister of that country and high-ranking officials, including Mr. Lavrov, by the way. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that yesterday, on the social networks in the Central African Republic, appeared a photo. As you know, yesterday was a celebration by Russia of the victory of the Second World War, and appeared on the social media in the Central African Republic a photo where you could see together for that celebration the Russian ambassador in Bangui, the Russian military attaché, some UN Russian peacekeepers of the mission, and the two Wagner representatives in the country all together.
That's a real change, isn't it? I mean,
yeah,
before
really,
they would keep each other at arm's length.
Yes, definitely, and before
Why?
all the
Why
Russian
is this
diplomats.
Why are they happy to have their picture taken together?
Well, now because Yevgeny Prigozhin has come out, has said, I am the Wagner group, etc., etc. And so now they seem to be, they're showing themselves together, contradicting actually what the Russian ambassador did yesterday in Bangui was contradicting directly what Mr. Lavrov is saying now. And we have many evidence of Russian diplomats being in touch, having talks with the Wagner representative in various countries.
So I'm sorry, I'm going to have to go back to what you said at the, what you both said at the outset, that is, if they're having their picture taken with Yevgeny Prigozhin, the happy grandfather that he was criticizing, are you sure it's Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, but I mean, be careful about what's happening in Africa and what's happening in Ukraine. In Ukraine, Prigozhin is in a very difficult position, which is not the case in Africa. In Ukraine, he wanted this victory. He doesn't want a victory. He has been fighting against the Russian army for a very long time. And at the end of the day, the head of the Russian army is the President Putin. And so, because he knows very well Putin, he's able to tick a bit against Putin without naming it. Putin knows that his name has not been quoted, but that Prigozhin is speaking about him. And is probably afraid that this powerful, as you said, it's not only, it's a holding, it's very powerful, can be dangerous for him.
Again, and I'll put it to you, Raphaël Parence, you have, in that report you co-authored, you talk about how Yevgeny Prigozhin's not the only one who has a paramilitary group, that, for instance, the energy giant Gazprom has a nascent armed group, that the defense minister, his rival, Sergei Shoigu, has a group called Patriot. So there are different paramilitary groups. What is Wagner's role in the universe of Vladimir Putin today?
Yeah, so I think the Wagner Group is a bit unique from those other organizations for several reasons. It's the sheer level of activities that makes it different. It's involved in all these different economic ventures that we've been talking about. It's involved as a conventional military force in Ukraine. At the same time, it's more of an expeditionary force in Africa. It's building these military-to-military relationships with client states and also fighting counter-terror campaigns and counterinsurgency campaigns. At the same time, it does look similar to previous mercenary groups in that it is recruiting veterans, but the scale of economic activity is really what makes it different. In terms of the difference between Wagner Group and Gazprom, it's not clear exactly what Gazprom is going to be, whether it's just defending, Gazprom's oil facilities in the field or what. Patriot has, in fact, this is Minister Shoigu's venture, has competed with Wagner in the past, so that is a possibility, but it's not clear how big or how strong that organization will be into the future.
Well, in order to, when we try to understand what really that strange entity, Wagner, I think
And why you need so many paramilitary groups, why you don't have just one army?
Yeah, well, especially because it's a big war in Ukraine and also there's a lot of power competition in Moscow. But I think, and that's what we are explaining in our report, the Wagner groups has to be connected. To understand it, you have to connect it to the history of organized crime in Russia, how it evolved since Putin has come in power, and the fact that actually the Kremlin has used various criminal groups for its own purpose and objective. And basically what we have with Wagner is a kind of a big entity, a kind of mafia-type organizations sponsored by a state and used by a state for its purpose. What is happening now that Yevgeny Prigozhin...
Is that unique in the world?
It's kind of unique. It's not completely unique, but at this scale, and to do secret diplomacy, for instance, and secret operations overseas, it's quite unusual at this scale.
So the Vladimir Putin who frequented Yevgeny Prigozhin in the 1990s when it was the rough and tumble days after the fall of the Soviet Union in St. Petersburg, that leads to this?
Yes, definitely. It's part of the history, the history of organized crime in Russia. The criminal background of Yevgeny Prigozhin is quite telling, and the fact that at the time of Putin, he managed actually to control organized crime in Russia, because before him it was really out of control, and he managed to control several organized crime organizations, and even have this one who became quite a useful tool overseas, not in Russia, but not only in Russia, but also overseas, and that is really working like a mafia-type organization.
And yes, and I just would like to say that is the reason why it is so important to use the right vocabulary. For instance, in the United States, Wagner Group has been considered as a criminal organization. In the United States, it's been considered as a criminal organization, which is much more relevant, in my view, than considering it as a terrorist one, because there are lots of tools to pursue, to investigate the kind of criminal networks which can be dismantled, in fact, which is not necessarily the case with terrorism, because the way in which we will be able to address this kind of threat is very important.
So you're saying you'd prefer to see the U.S. Treasury Department rather than Homeland Security or the CIA
or the military itself to be involved to counter Wagner. But in fact, maybe there is a need to mobilize different sets of tools to counter this new actor. But I think the criminal dimension is absolutely crucial as the informational one.
When you heard Sergei Lavrov speaking there, he employed the term that Wagner is a private military company. What was your reaction listening to the Russian foreign minister's words?
Certainly, it's a private company. Certainly, linked with the state, but it's a private company. What was very interesting in what Mr. Lavrov said is that he changed completely the chronology of what's happening. In fact, it's because after the second coup in Mali, Wagner was asked to come. Then the French forces left. It's not the country. It's not they left and Wagner came to replace the French.
But there were already tensions.
Yeah, and the second thing, which is also very important, is that currently in Mali, you have the several jihadist group, but Bakayoko knows better than me that are now pushing. And they are around Menaka, they are in several places. So in fact, Wagner is not really fighting these guys. Wagner, has
it ever fought them? Is it more just in the gold mining areas?
No.
Not in Mali.
No, but in fact, they are there to protect the power. That's it. They are here as a garde du corps, if you like. They are not really here to fight an enemy far away in Mali.
So, Yevgeny Prigozhin, if, as Thierry Vircolon says, it should be considered, and you agree, as a criminal organization, how do you get that message across? And you were talking earlier about public opinion in sub-Saharan Africa. How do you get that message across to public opinion and to the leadership in countries like Ivory Coast, Niger, Guinea, Burkina Faso, where they reportedly are still haven't fully made up their mind on which path they want to engage in?
But that's where things are very difficult, because in fact, Wagner presence is very different from one country to one other. For instance, in Mali, it's very difficult to know if the company is involved in gold mining. It's very difficult. The situation is very different from the car where it is involved in diamond exploitation. And it is also the case, I would say, maybe in Burkina Faso, where there is absolutely no certainty about Wagner presence. But what is sure is that we can see that there are growingly an influence of trolls which are using exactly the same kind of techniques as in Mali, including by trying to attack humanitarian organizations. And this is a very new kind of approach in those countries.
Raphaël Parence, Russia has clearly lost the public relations war here in Europe. I mean, we saw it was a unanimous vote in the French Parliament on Tuesday. But listening to Niagale, they're doing great in fighting that public relations war in Africa. What can be done differently, again, by the leadership of these countries and to counter misinformation?
Well, I think we need to ask whether the leaders in these countries really want to be countering misinformation if it plays into what they want, which is security and is preventing these jihadist groups from making gains, from insurgent groups from making gains, and ultimately remaining in power. If misinformation is what it takes, then it's not surprising that they've decided to go down this route. What the West kind of has to do in response is to come up with better ways of building up civil society, because clearly the military-only approach to counter-terror and policy in Africa is not enough.
Thierry Vircolon, do the French get that message?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure, but what is clear is that the Wagner group is actually quite active, and I think we see that they are in trouble in Ukraine, but in Africa they will hold their position, and they will be supported by Moscow to hold that position, because they have made real inroads in French-speaking Africa, and therefore the Kremlin consider them as still a useful tool in Africa, and that maybe we're going to see in the coming months. Maybe we'll have an interesting paradox in the fact that they will be in trouble in Russia, and maybe they will see what happens on the front, on the battlefield, but they will still be maintained and supported in the African countries. So that's another battlefield.
A different battlefield?
It's the global way of looking at the world for Mr. Putin, is that the fight is not only in Ukraine, he's fighting a global war, and part of this war is in Africa. And so I think that your question, did the French army learn about that? I think that yes, but too late. I mean, they've lost the first battle, and it's very difficult to come back when you've lost this battle, because all the net is now really taken by Wagner, and you have a big difficulty to come back on this position.
Dominique Trinquant, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank Yevgeny Prigozhin, Thierry Vircolon, Raphaël Parence for being with us from Brazzaville. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.